Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm here with my husband Nick.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about The Other Bennet Sister. So specifically today we're going to be talking about the recent adaptation of The Other Bennet Sister, the mini-series that's based on this novel by Janice Hadlow. So I have read the novel, I read it first 6 years ago, and then I have just finished rereading it literally about 10 minutes ago in preparation for this video. But Nick and I watched the mini-series together.
And I've just seen the new TV series, so we've got slightly different perspectives. Maybe.
Yeah, you will be reviewing the mini-series as a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and I will be reviewing it both as a retelling of Pride and Prejudice and as an adaptation of this book. And I guess I'll talk a bit about my thoughts on the book as well. This video was specifically requested, so there you go. We should also say that this video will have spoilers, I guess, both for the novel and the mini-series. We'll talk about the mini-series and I'll also talk about what's different from the novel to the mini-series. So this is probably only worth watching if you have either read or seen it. So The Other Bennet Sister, the novel, was very popular when it came out back in 2020, and the mini-series has been very, very popular indeed. And I've spoken to a lot of people who have seen the mini-series who didn't even know it was a novel. So it's definitely sort of gone beyond the novel. And both, I think, have been very popular and very loved. I didn't love the book quite as much as some people did, though I did like it, and I think I have a sort of similar feeling about the miniseries. So what were your thoughts on the miniseries as someone who hasn't read the book? Like, as a take on Pride and Prejudice, what were your overall thoughts?
Your thoughts on it, or as a take on Pride and Prejudice?
Okay, thoughts on it first, and then we'll do as a take on Pride and Prejudice.
It's fun. I think the short answer is funny. He's got a really good sense of humour. He's got a very good sort of visual sense of humour as well. I thought the actress who played Mary is really good. Yeah. Very solid performance. I think actually all the performances are pretty good, I think.
Yeah, Caroline Bingley was great.
Caroline Bingley was
good.
Excellent.
She's got such a great manner and such great facial expressions for an Austen antagonist. She also plays Mrs. Elton in the 2020 Emma film. Yeah, and in general I think the cast was very strong. Yeah,
it's very strong, it's very fun, it's interesting. It was quite enjoyable to explore Regency London as well, because I feel like that's not something I know a lot about, and it's certainly not something I've seen represented visually very often.
And also not the top of society. I think we spoke about this as we were watching it, actually it's nice to see the London lives of the gardeners who are living a sort of middle class, not upper class life, which is what you mostly see depicted from the Regency period on screen and in books.
On the less positive side, I think it was just quite a bit too long, to be honest. I feel like there was quite a lot of padding to get it. I think it's 10 episodes.
Yeah.
I think it would have been stronger as 8 or maybe even 6.
Yeah, I would really agree. I think that was my main criticism of the series, and actually is my main criticism of the book as well, that I think it's too long and I think the pacing isn't as strong as it could be, and I felt that about the miniseries. And it's quite interesting thinking about the miniseries in comparison to the book, because the miniseries has a very different plot structure to the book. It moves things around a lot and it does cut some things, but it more moves things around than cuts things, and it adds quite a lot in. To make it also quite long, and also I thought not paced as tightly as it could be. And I think about pacing a lot, I think partly because my day job is an editor, and that's something that you do a lot of as an editor. But I feel like both the miniseries and the books could be more tightly paced, and I think I would have loved the miniseries more if it had been, 6, 7, 8 episodes more tightly contained. I think the beginning and the end especially, I would have had the first 2 episodes, I think could have been one. I didn't need quite as much of Pride and Prejudice and the sort of the timeline of Pride and Prejudice, and I think the final 2 episodes could have been condensed as well, probably.
I suppose, to be fair, and maybe moving into it being an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, actually the ending is quite similar, in terms of beats, as Pride and Prejudice, in that you have a denouement and a dramatic moment, and then there's a long wrapping up.
Yeah, it's true. That is a sort of Austen-y ending structure. Yeah, that is a good point. I feel like we didn't need to see as much of the characters from Pride and Prejudice in the miniseries. Obviously we need to see lots of Mary Bennett, it's her story, but there is more of Mrs. Bennett and the Bennet sisters in the miniseries than there is in the book, and I I feel like I didn't personally need that, but I also feel like if you haven't read the book and you're watching it as a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, I guess people kind of do want to see the characters from Pride and Prejudice that they know and love.
I think there were a few bits as well, and I think this might be something more for you to talk about. Again, maybe moving more towards the book versus adaptation things. There was some stuff that didn't make a whole lot of like logical sense in the miniseries. In particular, I think Mary goes down to the gardeners in the series as a governess, but then they don't really treat her as a governess. Her like premise for being in London is quite vague, which I think is odd because I think you told me that she doesn't go as a governess in the book.
No, yeah.
Which is an odd change because it would have made a lot more sense.
Yeah, I think that was a really weird change they made. So in the novel, The Other Bennet Sister, Mary Bennett, after her father's death, goes initially with her mother to live at Jane and Bingley's house, which is where Mrs. Bennett settles and lives. And she stays there for a bit, and then Caroline Bingley's also there, just being horrible to her. She doesn't want to be there, so she goes to stay with Lizzie. She likes her time with Lizzie, she gets on well with Lizzie, but she's aware that Mr. Darcy is like reserved and shy and obviously not at his ease when Mary's there. Then she goes to stay at Longbourn with Charlotte and Mr. Collins for a while, until it's clear that Charlotte doesn't really want her there because Mary obviously gets on with Mr. Collins a bit better than Charlotte does. And then she's like, I have nowhere to go, no one wants me. And she writes to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and says, can I come and stay with you? And therefore she goes as a guest and she is the one who asks, which I like a lot more as the way of getting her to London, partly because it's Mary being sort of more active and Mary making a choice, but also that loneliness and that sense of I have nowhere to go, no one wants me, is really poignant in the book.
I think it's odd as well because I sort of like the way the sort of series ends with Mary being like, well, actually maybe I'll go and be a governess and like I've achieved sort of independence of spirit, maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't really make sense because she's already been a governess. Like.
Yeah, I also thought that was a weird choice. And in fact, in the novel, Mary very much doesn't want to be a governess because that is sort of the other path open to her. And at one point she meets Lady Catherine and Lady Catherine de Bourgh is like, well, I've placed many people as governesses. I could find someone, that you could work for. And Mary sort of really doesn't want to do it because she knows she would hate that as a job, which I think is very consistent with her character as, yes, she's studious and likes reading and books, but being studious is not the same thing as being a good teacher. There's a moment towards the end of the book where Mary thinks, well, if I'm going to live a single life, maybe I'll write. That's one throwaway line in the novel, but I think that would have been a much nicer thing to do in the miniseries, because, in the novel, she very much doesn't want to be a governess, and rebels against sort of that there are only two options open to her, or maybe three options open to her in life. There's being a governess, there's marrying someone, or there is living off her sisters, basically.
It's interesting that you say in the book she doesn't want to be a governess because actually that's not how it's framed at all in the thing. And also it's interesting because it's sort of framed as her being and sort of getting better at being a governess, but she's just clearly not a very good governess in the way she teaches them and like...
Yeah. I remember you saying as well while we were watching the miniseries that Mr. Ryder's sudden inheritance from Lady Catherine doesn't make any sense in the miniseries. It's not explained at all.
Yeah, so that confused me because he's already obviously wealthy and is talking about going off to Italy.
Yeah.
So it is unclear to me why getting a whole bunch of extra money from Lady Catherine de Bourgh suddenly means that he wants to marry her. Yeah. It doesn't follow.
Yeah. So in the book, Anne de Bourgh marries someone that Lady Catherine doesn't approve of, so she makes Mr. Ryder her heir. But the sort of whole structure of the love triangle is very different in the novel. And they rearranged it a lot in the miniseries, which was quite interesting and in some ways worked better, I think. So in the novel, we have the whole sort of expedition to the lakes and everything before Mr. Ryder has said anything to Mary about his feelings. Everything at Longbourn in the miniseries is invented for the miniseries. What happens at the lakes is Tom is there with Mary. He's sort of about to make an offer. Mr. Ryder shows up. Mr. Ryder says to Tom, I've become Lady Catherine's heir now because Anne de Bourgh's going to marry someone. And Tom realises that Ryder is interested in Mary, and so he retreats. When they get back to London, Mr. Ryder asks Mary to be his mistress, and then when she says no, the next day asks her to marry him. It's much more contained, and it's very, very much at the end of the novel. Then Tom comes back at the very end. And I actually think the way the miniseries did it with Mr. Ryder asking her to be his mistress, and then basically having time to be like, I will do whatever Mary wants. That makes sense to me to happen over a much longer period of time. I like the way the miniseries structured the love triangle better, But the thing I didn't like in the miniseries was the addition of Miss Baxter, because it didn't really... I don't know what she was doing there. Miss Baxter from the miniseries is not in the novel. And I don't know why they added her.
I think, as someone who hasn't read the novel, I think that was fine. Actually, I can understand why they put that in, because I think otherwise, particularly the way it's framed in the series, Tom Hayward and Mary have such obvious chemistry, and they obviously get on, that why aren't they just courting?
Yes,
if there isn't some reason for Tom Hayward not to be pursuing her.
Yeah. In the book, the pacing is very different. Mary doesn't get to London until halfway through the novel, which is one of the pacing problems I have with the book, I think, is that I feel like the second half with Mary, with the gardeners, is the strongest bit, and the bit I really, really loved. But it takes quite a long time to get there. So I really understand why in the miniseries they move quite a lot of things around. So everything with Charlotte and Mr. Collins, which in the book happens before Mary goes to London, happens later, which I think makes sense. But because they moved everything around, therefore Tom and Mary know each other for a lot longer before they sort of fall in love, I guess. I think the thing I didn't like about the addition of Miss Baxter is that in the Other Bennet Sister, we have this story about Mary, who is, in Pride and Prejudice, considered very unattractive and plain, and, no one's ever going to want to marry her, etc. And actually, in the Other Bennet Sister, Mary is the heart of a love triangle because two men are really interested in her and two men fall in love with her. And I really like that. A very obvious thing to do with the story of a character like Mary Bennett is have it be an unrequited love story, and have Mary fall in love with someone who's interested in someone else. That sort of feels like the obvious thing to do, and that isn't what this book is. And I feel like in the miniseries, by having, Mary's falling in love with Tom Hayward, but he's with someone else, that feels much more conventional and much sort of more cliche, I suppose.
I can see that, but I don't think it didn't work. And also because it's quite obvious that Tom Hayward does actually quite like...
Yeah.
I don't think it feels like Mary's pursuing someone who's not interested in her. It's someone who has, I suppose if you like, you're borrowing from my Sense and Sensibility and stuff, there are someone who's made an ill-advised connection or a connection that they now regret. And
is bound by honour. Yeah.
But I think it's pretty obvious that Tom Hayward would rather be pursuing Mary, but is obviously an honourable man, so he's not going to do it.
It's true, I suppose if I had seen the miniseries without reading the book, maybe I wouldn't have found that a strange plot element, or I wouldn't have disliked it. But I think because I'd read the book, I was like, why, if they introduce this character, what's the point? It felt like an artificial obstacle because it's not an obstacle in the novel. But obviously, if you're watching it having not read the book, it doesn't feel like an artificial obstacle. What did you think of it as a retelling of Pride and Prejudice?
I think it's quite an interesting thing to do with Pride and Prejudice. I think it's a fun story.
Yeah.
It's nice to sort of see that spun out and see what happens, or examine different parts or different ways. Yeah. I have a few caveats. I should say I have read Pride and Prejudice once, so I am not an expert on Pride and Prejudice.
I have read it about 15 times, so I am a bit of an expert.
You probably have a different view on some of it to me, but I think, for instance, there's a real antipathy to Charlotte Lucas and Mrs. Bennett.
Yeah.
I think you can read Charlotte Lucas that way. It's not how I would read Charlotte Lucas, but I think it is a fair sort of slant to put on the character.
It's a valid interpretation, but it's not mine.
I think it pushes it a bit far.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little bit two-dimensional, maybe. Yeah. I don't think Janice Hadlow liked Charlotte Lucas.
Yeah.
Which I quite like Charlotte Lucas, and I've got a lot of sympathy for the position Charlotte Lucas finds herself in. And I think Austen did, too.
Yeah.
But I think that's a fair interpretation of Charlotte Lucas as basically an opportunist. Without much in the way of redemption, and also has a pretty miserable punishment.
And I think Janice Hadlow makes Charlotte Lucas bitter in a way that I don't think she would be or is. Both in the book and in the miniseries, I feel like the interpretation of Charlotte Lucas is a harsher person than I think she is.
But I think it is interesting because in Pride and Prejudice we see Charlotte Lucas not long after marriage, where she's like, no, I've ordered it all, so life is fine.
Yeah.
And I just keep Mr. Collins in that room and I sit in this room and isn't that nice? But also that is a bit sad.
Yeah, and also how does Mr. Collins feel about the fact that they don't spend time together, like, you know, and I think that is a thing worth you know, looking at. And I think the depiction of Mr. Collins in both the book and the miniseries I really like. You might like less so because you hate Mr. Collins with a passion.
I do hate Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. I was moved to feel a certain amount of sympathy for this iteration of Mr. Collins, and I think, again, while that's not my interpretation of the character, I don't think it's an unfair reading of Mr. Collins.
And it is more my reading of Mr. Collins.
And I think, like you said, he's actually extremely young.
Yes,
you know, he's a very young idiot in Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah.
And, you know, rather than dismiss him as like a pompous windbag, you could look at him as someone who is like out of their depth and doesn't
and awkward and doesn't know what to say. And you know, I think in the adaptations he's often portrayed by someone in their 30s or 40s, but he's 25, like he's really young, and he's awkward and, you know, socially inexperienced and says the wrong thing a lot and says too much, and I feel a sympathy for that, and I think that is well done in the Other Bennet Sister.
And I liked his and Mary's, like, I liked the initial, like, him and Mary, like, getting to know each other. And then I liked the sort of reprise of that when, like, you know, they have a chat about how, you know, maybe life's a bit miserable, but that's, you know, that we all have our crosses to bear and we'll get through it. I think that's I thought it was quite nice. Like, I think it works. Basically, I think both readings work, albeit I think the Charlotte Lucas reading, I suppose it's interesting, like I said, you see her happy in the book, but maybe if we follow that for long enough, she wouldn't be happy. And I think that's an interesting idea. I think that's a valid reading, that maybe that system is not sustainable for the rest of someone's life. I do think Mrs. Bennett is I don't think it's a great reading of the character.
I agree.
Because I think that basically it is Mr. Bennett's version of Mrs. Bennett.
Yes, you're quite right. What a really good point. Sorry, go on.
Because she is ridiculous and also just really cruel.
Yeah, they make her into a bully, and she's not a bully.
She's not, but she is a bit silly.
Yeah.
But also, she is, like, her actual motivation is that she's absolutely terrified of her daughters ending up in poverty because they, you know, Mr. Bennett basically has not sort of arranged things. And they are in jeopardy. And I think she has a keen understanding of that. Every single other daughter's married off. It's sort of sorted. I think the sort of she should be more relaxed, I think, at this point, that Mary was basically going to be okay.
Because really, once Jane and Elizabeth have made such great matches, like Mary and Kitty are going to be fine. Like they've got the family to support and help them, and Mrs. Bennet would know that, and that does take the pressure off. But I think the sort of like really targeted bullying, I just feel like that's not consistent with her as a character. I feel like she might say something that's rude but not in so many like pointed, directed, like really, really calculated ways.
Because obviously, like, she has her confrontation with Mrs. Bennet, which I don't really think we needed, to be honest.
But she's not really in the book.
We go back to Mrs. Bennet too often, I think, in the TV series. We spend she's quite good, the actress who plays Mrs. Bennet, and I don't think it's a fair reading of the character from Pride and Prejudice. But if you ignore that, I think it's just fine that, you know, she's got a controlling and like, unpleasant mother. But I think we keep going back to her, and actually by the time we get like resolution in, I think it's like episode 7 or episode 8, where she's just like, no, I'm actually gonna, I think by that point I was sort of like, we've done this, like Mary's actually gone off and like lived independently in London. I think it was a bit drawn out, but also in that confrontation Mrs. Bennet basically says this. I think this is the point I would make, because I think you could argue that we're being unfair, because actually Mrs. Bennett's like, all I ever wanted was to see my daughters married and look after them. And I think she does say it, and that's fine. But I don't think the character of Mrs. Bennet in the rest of the adaptation is at all that person.
Yeah, they give her like a few sentences of a redeeming moment after having made her completely irredeemable through the rest of the series, and that didn't work for me.
And I think I would rather they had committed to her being irredeemable, or they'd changed her character elsewhere, basically.
So one of the things I remember thinking when I first read The Other Bennet Sister, and which I did think again on this reread, is that I really disagree with Janice Hadlow's take on Mrs. Bennet. And, you know, one of the things I love about reading Jane Austen retellings is seeing other people's interpretations of Jane Austen's work, because I think Jane Austen is one of those very clever, subtle, nuanced writers that does leave lots of room for interpretation. There are lots of ways to read characters, but I think my reading of Mrs. Bennet is a very sympathetic one. That like she has a point. There's going to be, you know, they're all in trouble if they can't get married, and she is quite silly, but also she has a good point, and her husband's doing nothing to try and help their family. I have made a whole video that's a good like half hour long about Mrs. Bennet, which I'll leave link down below. But I remember thinking when I first read The Other Bennet Sister that the interpretation of Mrs. Bennet in it is very much not my interpretation. And then in the miniseries, I think they've gone even further and they've put a lot more of Mrs. Bennet into it. So in the novel, the first like third is the course of Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet's in there a lot. And then there's sort of like one chapter on their way to the lakes, they stop off at Jane and Bingley's house and meet her again. And then at the end, she does come back when Mr. Ryder's sort of coming to the house and paying lots of attention to Mary. Mrs. Bennet does turn up in London and does like try and persuade Mary to marry Mr. Ryder. But she's not as big a presence in the novel as she is in the miniseries. And because that was one of the things I didn't really get on with in the novel, that was a much, you know, it's much bigger in the miniseries. It's such a big part of the miniseries. And for me, it's just not consistent with how I read that character in Pride and Prejudice.
I also think, and I think I've seen this the same in the book, that Mr. Bennet dies pretty early on.
Yeah.
I understand why you would do that from like a perspective and also just in terms of keeping things under control. I would probably have liked to see a reinterpretation of Mr. Bennet as well, in a way that I don't think we really got, because I think actually he gets away with being...
Yeah.
I think he's often regarded quite fondly, partly because he's quite funny.
Yeah.
But also, like, actually...
He's a terrible father.
He's you could definitely tear a strip off Mr. Bennet if you wanted to.
Yeah. So the novel does do more of that. We do see more of Mr. Bennet. And there's some sections early on in the novel where Mary starts going to Mr. Bennet's library to read books, and she sort of really wants to engage with him on an intellectual level, and he just doesn't want to engage with her about that. Like, he just won't take her seriously. He only really has time for Elizabeth and not really for any of the other sisters. And there's some quite like poignant moments about that. And when Mr. Bennet dies, Mary is quite like, she sort of feels that they could have had a good relationship and he was never willing to put the work in, and so it didn't happen, and therefore that's sort of a loss. So I think the novel does that better. But Mrs. Bennet is still like, as you say, Mr. Bennet's interpretation of her. I
suppose it's the sort of thing that I think is completely fair to cut in a series and an adaptation for television. But also, if you're going to do 10 episodes, we probably could have had more of that.
The other character from Pride and Prejudice I wanted to touch upon was Caroline Bingley, because Caroline Bingley is quite different in the miniseries to the book. And I really liked what the miniseries did with Caroline Bingley, and much more strongly agreed with the miniseries take on Caroline Bingley than I do with the novel's take on Caroline Bingley. So in the novel, The Other Bennet Sister, most of Caroline Bingley's behaviour is the same as in the miniseries, and lots of her lines are the same, etc. But when they go up the lakes, Caroline Bingley doesn't fall. That doesn't happen, and there's no moment of Caroline Bingley softening towards Mary Bennet. Caroline Bingley does go and meet Mary Bennett in order to confront her about Mr. Ryder, and Mary does confess that she loves Tom Hayward, and Caroline Bingley writes to Tom Hayward to tell him so, but she doesn't do it as a kind thing. She does it as I'm going to mortify this girl for this, man she has an unrequited passion for. And she never softens towards Mary, and she's always awful towards Mary. And I feel like that is also a harsh reading of Caroline Bingley. Again, I've done a whole video on Caroline Bingley, I'll leave that link down below, but I think Caroline Bingley, again, is a character who is very young in Pride and Prejudice, who is obviously exceptionally jealous and obviously has this thing for Mr. Darcy, whether it's a proper attraction, whether it's about the money and the position, whatever it is, she really wants to marry Mr. Darcy and he has no interest. And I feel quite sorry for her. And there are moments where she does or says things where, she's just obviously behaving in a way that isn't helping her own cause. And I thought that this book's take on Caroline Bingley is a little bit harsh. And I think the miniseries take on Caroline Bingley was great. I really, really liked it. And I really liked that they gave her a sort of softening moment at the end, but also like Caroline Bingley's not a person who really knows how to soften. And I thought that was done really well.
So I really liked the series take on Caroline Bingley. I thought she was really good. I mean, obviously the actress was great, which I think makes a big difference. Sort of absolutely perfect casting.
Yeah.
What an expression. I think they really nailed it. To be honest, if I had read that version of Caroline Bingley in the book, I'd be like, yeah, that does sound like Caroline Bingley. I think that you can look at a lot of reasons why Caroline Bingley does behave the way she does, but also, she is awful.
Yeah, I think I'm slightly overly sympathetic towards Caroline Bingley. I mean, I also do sort of hate her, but also I feel quite sorry for her. But I think I'm probably slightly unfair, more than perhaps I really mean that Janice Hadlow was being unfair.
One thing I think maybe I would have wanted from Caroline Bingley, or I suppose this is more like things you could explore in a retelling that Pride and Prejudice doesn't go into in a lot of detail, is the class dynamic. And that actually, although Caroline Bingley is from a wealthy family, she's probably from a family that's beneath Mary's family in terms of like rank.
Yeah, she is not from the gentry, and Mary is.
And I think it's interesting that doesn't get explored.
Yeah.
I don't think it's particularly explored. I don't know whether it's explored in the book, but it's not explored in the TV series, really, I think.
There's one bit in the book where Caroline Bingley says something quite rude about the gardeners and sort of like, you know, people who work in trade, and how, you know, what a shame it must be to have your life constantly disturbed by business. And Mary says, like, oh, well, you must know a lot about that because your father was in trade. Did they put that in the miniseries? I can't remember.
I don't. Maybe they did. I didn't spot it.
Yeah, yeah. But it's there's not much of it.
But like, particularly now, Mary, like Elizabeth is married to Mr. Darcy.
Yeah.
Like, Mary's definitively above her socially, and I think that would have been an interesting thing to explore in a different way.
It would have been,
Also, I suppose this just really occurred to me because I think at the end of the mini-series, they say, oh, she's got off to pursue Mr. Ryder in Italy. Do you think they're actually implying she's gone off to be Mr. Ryder's mistress in Italy, or just that she's gone off to try and get him to marry her?
So the end of the novel says that Caroline Bingley is living with Mr. Ryder in Italy, and no one's quite sure whether or not they're married. That's how the novel ends. There is a line in the novel that like Mary thinks that they're probably married because she thinks Caroline would make sure they were, like she would engineer the situation. I don't think Caroline would settle for anything less than marriage. She's too proud. You know, so obviously there's many more complicated things going on in there, but the status is so important to her. Regardless of what her feelings for Mr. Ryder are, I feel like her opinion on status would always come before any feelings.
She's just attracted to protégés of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, basically.
Yeah. It was interesting. When I was rereading this book, a thought occurred to me that hadn't occurred to me before or while watching the miniseries. But there's a mention of Mr. Ryder inheriting instead of Anne de Bourgh. Now, Anne de Bourgh's made a bad match because he's the only other relation. And I was like, what about Colonel Fitzwilliam? Why isn't Colonel Fitzwilliam Lady Catherine's heir? And then I thought, in an initial draft of this, like, was Mr. Ryder initially meant to be Colonel Fitzwilliam, and then the character didn't fit, so she made a new person? I don't know. I feel like actually his relation to the family, and actually Caroline Bingley's interest in him, like all of that would make quite a lot of sense with him being Colonel Fitzwilliam.
Should we talk about the love triangle?
Yes.
So I think it's interesting because I think I kind of...
You quite like Mr. Ryder. You were Team Ryder.
Well, I think I was just reflecting on this, and I think it's interesting because I came into this very much in an Austen frame of mind.
Yeah.
And I don't think an Austen love triangle is quite like a modern one.
No.
In that there is a definitively right answer to an Austen love triangle.
Yes, yeah.
And basically, it's not really a love triangle. There is the love interest and there is the rake.
Yeah, there's the distraction.
Mr. Ryder turned up and I was like, well, you know, we've had Tom Hayward with his nice northern accent, so there's the rake. And I sort of immediately identified him as the rake, and then actually, during the course of the rest of the series, like, he's quite a nice man, really. Like, I think he's quite interesting. He's obviously a bit careless. I think it's really interesting as like a kind of deconstruction or like a more modern retake on like that Austen dilemma, which I think worked really quite well generally. I suppose that I don't think it doesn't work, and I think it's obviously a nice ending. You know, Tom Hayward is obviously a nice man. Like, you know, he's got a charming Yorkshire accent.
He's not northern in the book. I'm really sorry to disappoint you. He's from Hampshire. Yeah. I thought you'd be disappointed.
I wonder why they gave him that, because it's quite a pronounced choice.
They probably just cast someone. They just probably, in the casting, saw someone great with a Yorkshire accent and thought, we'll lean into that.
I mean, most actors can do different voices.
Yeah, I know, but maybe they were like, what a lovely Yorkshire accent he has, we'll keep that.
Oh, but no, because he goes back to the north as well.
Yeah, but in the book he just goes to Hampshire.
I don't really take issue with Tom Hayward other than he's a bit wet. Like,
he's quite nice.
He is quite nice. I think that's fine.
He's less wet in the book, actually. The bits in the miniseries where you see him interacting with the children of the gardeners and like giving them sweets and playing with them, and that sort of more playful side of Tom Haywood is more of a part of the book. Like, until quite late on, until he starts to think that Mary likes Mr. Ryder and sort of become quite sad. Like, he's a slightly more lively character than I think in the miniseries, possibly.
Yeah, the thing that I thought was interesting is that I genuinely didn't think that had Mary made the other choice, she'd necessarily have massively regretted it. I know she's like, I don't love him, but it's fine.
But if she did love him, would she have been happy not being married because they could have had a free life? And I think the problem is obviously in the society they live in, that kind of freedom is not actually available.
Not for women.
Yeah.
Mr. Ryder is ultimately insulated from any risk by his position and his wealth.
Yeah.
Like, he may not be invited to all the parties, but like, he'd be fine.
Yeah.
But Mary would be ruined, if you like, from a like social perspective. And I suppose what I thought was interesting though, and the thing I thought was interesting about that as a possibility to dangle in front of the reader, is that actually, like, throughout the book we see society continuously reject Mary.
Yeah.
So I actually thought it would be quite an interesting ending for Mary to turn around and reject society.
Yeah. And I've just read a different Mary Bennett retelling by Lindsay MacLeod, The Unlikely Pursuit of Mary Bennett, which is about Mary and Charlotte Lucas falling in love and, rejecting society to go and be a couple together, which I thought was really great and really nice. And again, Mary is like, well, society's rejected me, I'm gonna, join the queer subculture. Great. Like, actually,
that's not the exact wording she uses.
No, but that's the general vibe of the novel. There are other Mary Bennett stories you could tell where Mary Bennett says, well, what if I don't want what everyone else wants? And in this book, it's very much about maybe Mary finding, Mary getting what everyone else wants.
I think that would be both my... I think that's the thing that I think was interesting is very much a deconstruction of like the Austen love triangle, and it looks at it quite interestingly. It makes this a bit more of a modern take. Mr. Ryder and Mr. Haywood aren't like the sort of love interest and the rake in quite the same way. Certainly in the series they are. There's more there. Like, there's more of a balance, and it's more about love. But equally, it is also basically following the Austen formula of what Austen likes is when love and also the correct, like, moral
convenient,
the proper choice and the like romantic choice coincide. And when when the romantic choice and the proper choice don't seem to coincide in Austen, there is always something that is revealed to show
why it wouldn't have been a good choice.
And I think that is interesting in that it kind of deconstructs it, but also it basically just replicates it.
Which I actually think is one of the reasons why people have so loved the miniseries and the book, because actually, people find that convention comforting, and also because people love Austen and want more of that feeling, and when something gives you that feeling, then that's really nice.
I don't mean that's necessarily a problem. I think I might have found it more interesting if they'd pushed things a little bit more in terms of like examining other directions. But equally, I love Pride and Prejudice. I've enjoyed all of Jane Austen, and like that formula really works. And maybe we don't get quite so many of those stories now because people are there are different ways of doing it, so maybe it's quite nice to modernise it. And
also I think there's also the sense of, there are lots of those stories from that time, but Mary is never the heroine of those stories. So in that sense, there's, on the one hand, it's empowering to give Mary a story where she rejects society, but on the other hand, it's empowering to give Mary a story where she gets the happy ending that she's been told she won't get because she's not pretty enough, or lively enough, funny enough, all of that stuff. So I do like that. Shocking behaviour. In the novel, I think Ryder is like a little bit more rakish, slightly. In the novel, Ryder is less open with Mary about what he's asking the first time he asks. It's only after he's like left the room that she's like, oh, he didn't actually mention marriage. That wasn't what he was asking. And then he comes back the next day and apologises and asks her to marry him.
So he proposes running away to Italy, or he says, come with me to Italy. She doesn't actually realise he's not offering marriage because I don't love you. And then he comes back the next day and says, will you marry me?
Yeah, because he doesn't realise that she didn't. He thinks that she did understand, and that's why she said no, but that's not what went on. I think how the miniseries does it works better. Personally. I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting, it works better in the book than me just explaining it. But I think in the miniseries, they made him a lot more open about his intentions, and a lot more, like, up front, which I thought worked well, and does make him a more likeable character. In the novel, he also, I don't think they do this in the miniseries, in the novel he says to Mary, sort of almost like, you have a duty to marry me because you've made me a better person, which I think is, that also lowers him in my estimation as, a bit of weird emotional blackmail. He is likeable in the book, but I think he's more likeable in the miniseries.
I think he's just like, and she talks about them being friends and stuff, and they obviously do, they have a real chemistry and get on, and it's just quite nice. And I think, I think it's interesting, I think, the way that works, and maybe that is more from the miniseries than the book, but more of a balanced, this is about what Mary wants, rather than one of these is a terrible choice.
Yeah, no, that is in the book as well. There is very much it's all, who does Mary love, is the important thing.
So something else might be known, but does the book do the same thing, where basically the miniseries kind of cheats a bit. Mr. Ryder has been rejected. Tom Hayward's disappeared. And she is like, I've actually come to terms and found inner peace, and I'm going to do this, and I have achieved my sort of perfect self-actualization without a romantic interest. And then it's like, oh, but you can also now have the happy ending.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's trying to have its cake and eat it a bit.
Yeah, they try and give her a sort of feminist independent ending, but then also the romance in it. Yeah, I think in the novel sort of does that, but it works much better. In that, when she's rejected Mr. Ryder, she's sort of like, well, I don't know that if Tom's going to come back, but I can be happy. I can build a life for myself. I'd feel happier in myself. And there is a moment where she thinks in passing, well, maybe I would write. Maybe I could write the books I love to read, the history books, and then Mr. Hayward comes back. So there's a little bit of that, but it's much more subtle and therefore works much better. Because I do think you're right. I think the series does try and have its cake and eat it with sort of two different endings.
Because I think that's the thing, is that actually I think the interesting thing about taking this and looking at Mary Bennett is that you could take it that she runs away with Charlotte Lucas and has complete or indeed with Mr. Ryder, but she rejects society in some way. It's actually the society that doesn't want me. I'm going to reject it and go and do something completely on my own terms. Or she says, well, actually, I don't need this. I'm going to live an independent life and sort of make my own way in the world. Or actually, which is obviously what the series really does. I assume the book does as well, but basically, she does get a happy romantic ending, and it is really, it's the same formula as Austen, which is interesting.
Yeah, and one thing I do find interesting, I know we touched on the pacing earlier, but in the novel, Tom Hayward and Mr. Ryder don't turn up till more than halfway through. Maybe it's just halfway through. The pacing of it is a coming-of-age story, in that we spend a lot of time with Mary and her thinking about herself sort of before the love story element takes over. But I ultimately think this is a love story, and I think it's a love story ending, and I think the love story is the strongest element of it. I do think the coming of age story elements work well, but I almost feel like it's a love story paced as a coming of age story, if you see what I mean. And I do feel like the miniseries also had that sort of struggle of, well, which is it more? Is it more a coming of age story? Is it more a love story? And they obviously introduced Tom Hayward a lot earlier in the series, which I think works better, but then also at the end they obviously wanted to have that sort of coming of age ending, but also the romantic ending. Yeah, there's a bit of a balancing act between those two strands of the book, I suppose, and the series. Do you have anything more to say?
Favourite character?
I mean, I do really like Mary, but I also, in the mini-series, the highlight was Caroline Bingley, just because that actress is so wonderful and perfect for Caroline Bingley. I really like Tom Hayward, and I think he's an interesting character in both the mini-series and the book, probably slightly more so in the book. But Mary, I thought, was well done. I also love the gardeners. I think they're really good in the book and in the mini-series, and I thought the mini-series was very true to the book, except that Mr. Gardner should be good at fishing. That's one of the only things we know about him from Pride and Prejudice, is that he's good at fishing. Anyway, there was a scene where he was not good at fishing, and I'm like, that's one of the few personal details we have about Mr. Gardner, is he's a nice man, he likes fishing. Anyway, but I thought they were done very well as well. What about you?
I liked Mr. Ryder.
Yeah,
actually,
he was really interesting. Yeah.
I did like. I think Mary's very good. Caroline Bingley is an excellent. But I think Mr. Ryder was I think just because he's not a character you would have got in Austen.
Yes, yeah.
And I think I found it quite refreshing to inject him into a Austen-esque drama.
Yeah, and as a deconstruction of the rake, as you say, he's a really interesting figure.
Because I think, that Henry Crawford, I think is a really great character. And Willoughby, like those two rakes are so interesting because you squint, particularly Henry Crawford, you squint and you're like, you could actually be the love interest, and you could be someone's love interest.
Yeah, there's a different story in which you could have a different role. Yeah.
And I think actually, particularly Henry Crawford, in some respects, he's the rake because he also doesn't really fit into the conventions of the time. Willoughby obviously is a bit different in that while you might find some sympathy for Willoughby, he ultimately is.
Yeah, he's also been a predator basically.
Yeah, Willoughby's done something sort of awful.
Yeah.
And I don't think Henry Crawford does anything quite like that.
Yeah.
And I think...
Yeah, Maria is in a very different... Yeah, all of that stuff is very different.
And I think Henry Crawford is someone's romantic hero. It just isn't Fanny Price's.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting to see that sort of dialed out and sort of played around with a bit into someone who isn't conventional and wouldn't be the right choice socially, but also isn't a bad person.
Yeah, but also who he because of the privileges Mr. Ryder has, he is able to ignore certain social conventions and doesn't really have an appreciation for the way that isn't the case for other people, but in a way that I think is explored really complexly, both in the book and the miniseries. He doesn't really understand the position of women. He thinks that the position of women is wrong and he wants more equality, but also he doesn't understand that the rules of society are not allowing that at the moment.
Wanting it doesn't make it so.
Yeah, and you can't pretend it is so.
And it's one of the things I think is interesting and why I think the Lady Catherine de Bourgh stuff is odd. Because actually I think that basically the sort of logic of the miniseries is he asks Mary to be his mistress and Mary's like, no, I can't do that. And he goes away and reflects on it and is like, actually, no, I understand why she said that, and I understand why that wasn't a good idea, and I shall come back now and say, oh, I've thought about it, and as I understand why you would need this, I care about you, and so I will offer this.
Yeah.
Whereas the fact that he's like, I've now got even more money.
In the book, things are moved around, and the proposition is after he's found out he's got the money from Lady Catherine. The impact him being Lady Catherine's heir has in the book is what makes Tom Hayward back away, is he thinks now Ryder is this sort of shining match for Mary, and at the same time he's sort of seeing how much Ryder likes Mary. That makes him think, I just have nothing to offer in comparison. That's the role that Fortune plays in the book, but I agree it didn't quite come across in the miniseries.
I suppose also, to be fair, because I was talking about how maybe it doesn't ultimately get away from the tropes of Pride and Prejudice. I suppose where it does get away is that the love match doesn't also happen to have a country estate.
Yeah.
I think it does obviously subvert at least the Pride and Prejudice trope. It always makes me laugh, that bit in Pride and Prejudice where it's like, oh, now I've seen how big your house is, I really do think I could care for you. And obviously that's not what is going on, but
and there is, and that stuff is knowing from Jane Austen as well, which is one of the reasons why it's really funny.
But I do think obviously she rejects she rejects wealth in favour of love, which is not something that Austen normally makes her heroines do.
Anything else to say?
No, I think if we're continuing the pretense that this is a review and not a series of interconnected rants, I would say it's worth watching the TV series. You could probably say the book's worth reading.
And the book is worth reading. I would say that I feel like I've been quite negative about both, but actually what I really mean to say is that both of them are 4 stars for me, not 5 stars. I don't mean that they're 2 stars for me.
Interesting with some flaws. And I do think, and maybe something we haven't talked about as much, it's a bit long, and there are some bits, like we were talking about with Mr. Ryder, where the sort of logic of the story and what is actually said is going on don't quite tally, I think. And maybe that's more of a miniseries point than a book point. But,
I would say so. But overall, worth a read, worth a watch, good fun, maybe a tiny bit too long, but I also feel like many people have not found it too long. So, see what you think.
And there's a Christmas special coming, apparently.
There is. I don't know what they're going to do with the Christmas special, but just show Mary and Tom having a nice life. So there we go. I think that's all we had to say. Do let us know your thoughts down in the comments. And otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.